RiMS Motorcycle Racing is a game which I've talked about quite a lot in the previous months on the channel, breaking down trailers and news that we have regarding it, because for those who don't know, I love motorcycles. Technically I am a rider myself, even though I haven't ridden since last year, and I love the opportunity to look at and review and potentially enjoy a new contender on that side of the gaming scene, because the motorcycle world is really overlooked when it comes to gaming. You've got only really two top-tier contenders at the moment, and they are for the more casual or production-based side, of course, the Ride series, and then for the hardcore, almost F1 of bike games, for people who don't care about collecting and just want to race, the MotoGP series. That leaves a nice big slice of potential niche in between the two, for a third party or even an existing one to muscle in on. Now, Kiloton Racing and Nacon, who of course provided me with the early access code, along with doubtless some other creators as well, to review this game before its release, and incidentally, if you're watching this day of, it has been released today on the Switch, PS4, PS5, Microsoft, and of course the current and previous generation of Xbox, the SX and One. The number one question is then, which end of the spectrum is this going for? Is this more of a ride, or is this more of a MotoGP? Well, interestingly, it actually nestles pretty well between the two. To get one of the major turn-offs out of the way though, there is a potential deal breaker, to the point where I put it in the thumbnail. There are only 8 bikes in the entire game. Now, they may do DLC later on, and that wouldn't surprise me in the slightest, maybe even large-scale DLC, but the reason why they've opted to have only 8 motorcycles becomes a lot more obvious when you actually play the game. See, this game makes a lot more sense if you start to think about it. This is not just a game which is skimping out on licenses to save money and then try and sell it off as a full-price game just to make a quick buck. That really is not the case here. Now, at the same time, I'm not saying this is going to be one of my absolute favourite bike games. The reason why is this. This is not a game about collecting bikes, but neither is it just a game about racing them. And this is where the little slice of genius comes into play, because the idea that they had, I think, is actually a really sound one. This game is about being the owner of your bike. See, right at the start of the game, you get to choose the motorcycle you want to begin with, and then you have to unlock the others, and you can choose any of the 8. I chose to start with an MV Agusta, because of course I did. You can choose any of them though, and that surprised me. It's not one of those games where you start with a little 125 or a 400 and work your way up. No, you've already got a top tier machine, but that's kind of cluing you into what the point is. You pick who you want to be with, who you want to represent, and what machine you want to call your own, and then that is where the idea of the game starts to really sprout into what I think is a pretty good idea. Now, the scale of the game puts me off a little bit, because I am a collector at heart. I love to have a ton of bikes, as many as possible, loads of tracks, and I care much more about the fun factor than I do about how realistic it is. With that being said though, interestingly, I do find myself more of a fan of realistic bike games than I am of realistic car games. I don't play Project Gotham and Assetto Corsa that much because I prefer to just have fun. I get more than enough real-world fun driving the real performance cars that I review on the channel, so I don't need to do that in the gaming world. When it comes to bikes though, I love it when a game gets the vibe correct. The sound, the wind, the feeling of weight, the tricky to perfect nature of riding a high-performance motorcycle. That is what RiMS is all about. It's not about collecting, and it's not even just about winning. And there are 2 things which in my opinion highlight that fact. One is this system where you can explode the bike in effect during the race by pressing the pad down in the centre of your controller, on the PlayStation at least, and you can check out the tyres, the brakes, all these different little things, and that was shown off in the trailer. Now that seems like a gimmick, and initially, and even for some people down the line, you may still think that it's a gimmick. When you tie that into a second thing during career mode in particular though, I think it makes a lot more sense. See, in career mode, they made a very bold move. Not only are there only 8 bikes, but you have to maintain the bike as well, refitting parts that have worn and paying actual credits that you've earned from racing to repair the bike so that you can keep using it at its peak form. You have to sell older used parts, fit newer better ones, and there are 500 parts to fit to the bikes in the game, from brake pads to everything, basically. Brake pads being the first one that you're taught how to do. And another nice little feature, and this again clues into the point that I'm making, is that you actually use your controller to, for instance, undo bolts, take pads out, put new ones in, and even to do pit lane changes on stuff like tyres and fuel. The focus is about you being one with the machine. You feel like it's your bike. That is what this game shines on. It does not shine when it comes to rivaling Ride at its own game. It doesn't even come close to something like the purity like an F1 fan would have of the MotoGP series, and it certainly won't be updated as much as those games are. However, when it comes to feeling like this is your bike, your pride and joy that you have to maintain, and also giving you that kind of real-world feel that everything has a cost, making you not only want to ride quickly but also take care of the bike, that's a unique angle. And that is genuinely something which those other games, at least from what I've played, certainly not Ride, they don't even attempt to do that. Now, I'm not saying I need that from my experience, but I think that that alone, coupled with the fact that you can, as I said, choose the bike and explode it during racing and look at how all the components are doing and what condition the bike's in, this gives the game a very unique approach and unique experience. It gives the game weight. It makes the bike feel, ironically, more tangible. Now, some people may think that I'm just buying into the idea too much, or maybe even being paid to say this. Well, for a start, none of my reviews are paid, so you don't need to worry about that. This is just my honest thoughts, and it's me appreciating what they were trying to go for. At least, this is the way I see it. Now, that certainly won't be for everyone. For sure, in fact, it won't be for everyone. If you're a casual player, you'll probably hate this game. Now, if you do buy this game, I think there's one particular kind of player who will really enjoy it. And I don't think that kind of player even has a category. You just either will or you won't. And in fact, you can probably tell pretty much from this review whether or not you will or won't. If what I said sounds appealing, if you love the idea of having this bike, taking care of it, in effect having it as like a friend that you're working through career mode in and seeing victories and losses together and keeping it in great condition and taking care of it, well, that's a pretty fantastic idea for a game. It gives each single bike so much more weight than these hundreds of interchangeable, meaningless bikes that you flick through in a game like Ride. Now, I still prefer that approach because that's just my style, such as Tourist Trophy or Ride, but for this kind of player, there isn't really anything else that offers this sort of approach. Now, that should pretty much tell you all you need to know about whether you want to buy it. How does it compare to the others in terms of stuff like realism, graphics, physics, etc.? Well, the physics can be changed depending on how realistic you want it to be. You've got two different buttons on a controller, for instance, for the front and rear brake. The way it's implemented into the game, the way the weight and the shifting of the rider on the bike is handled, I think is top-notch. They did a fantastic job. Again, a lot of people won't feel that way. If you're not familiar with bike games and you just jump straight on, you might even hate it after just a couple of corners because it does feel very realistic. In particular, what I would like to praise them on is the feeling of weight. Most bikes can turn on a dime in racing games, especially older ones such as Tourist Trophy. The bikes do have a certain amount of weight, but they turn pretty easily. Even a larger, heavier bike like a Suzuki Hayabusa, for example, you can throw them around once you get used to the game's physics. In this game, the bikes actually do feel like they have that weight that a real motorcycle does. And having ridden a motorcycle or two with the kind of performance that these have, I can tell you that they do feel accurate to real life, or at least about as much as a controller could hope to be. The one big demerit that I would give to this game, and it's a pretty serious one to be honest, but the caveat is I think they'll probably fix this fairly quickly after release, is that when you are in a multiplayer event, even against AI, for me at least, and maybe this is just an issue that I've had, maybe it's just a PS4 issue, as you'll probably see from some of the gameplay that I've included, it's very choppy. The frame rate is extremely bad in these certain events, and it also throws off the sound of the bike with the sound of gear changes coming off at incorrect times, etc. It just completely throws the game off. Now, I don't know if that's because this was intended for the PS5 and the Xbox One S and X. primarily, and they've kind of neutered it a bit for the previous consoles, or maybe just the previous consoles new to the game naturally by their limited power and processing in comparison to the newer stuff. That's entirely possible. But either way, that was how I found the game to be. As I said though, I suspect they'd probably solve that with a patch or two. That remains to be seen. I will say that if you are just somebody who loves bikes and wants to collect as many good bike games as possible, then yeah, it's worth a look. If you're not a super fan of the idea that I described, then you might want to wait a little bit. If you love the idea that I described, absolutely go for it, because you won't be disappointed. If what I described sounds great to you, it offers exactly that. Great experience of owning, riding and maintaining a bike. Very, very good focus on realistic graphics, realistic sound, realistic physics. It's spot on, in fact. I would say probably better than Ride, to be honest, in terms of realism, because it has the balance a little bit better. Sometimes when people try to make a realistic riding game, they can make them a little bit too twitchy. The bikes in this game are not twitchy. If anything, they feel probably heavier than you might expect them to be. And for the average player, somebody who again is more casual when it comes to motorcycle games, you might think that the bikes feel too heavy. Well, yeah, that's exactly how they should feel. In real life, motorcycles are bigger than you think they are, and when you're sitting on 160, 200 kilos of metal, you'd be surprised how heavy it feels, especially like a litre or 1200 bike with some serious power. So overall, I think they did a great job in many ways. I think for the debut of a new potential series, or maybe just a one-off game, it's a pretty strong entry. I think this one is probably destined to be a little bit more of a niched or super fan title. But as with some that's happened to in the past, it's not necessarily a bad thing. It's bad for business if that happens, but in terms of being an iconic game like an Enthusia, a road trip adventure, even something like a racing truck game that I reviewed years ago now on the channel, that can sometimes have a very dedicated, supportive, enthusiastic fandom. And I hope that at the very least that happens here, because the game I think does deserve it. Certainly isn't for everyone, but what it does do, it does very well. Overall though, that's it for my thoughts, and of course slap yours down below if you are planning to buy the game, if you think it looks good or bad from the trailers, if you've already played it, and of course if you're watching this down the line and maybe a year from when I release it, whatever, drop your thoughts down below then. But overall that's it for this review. Stick around on the channel for more, and I have reviewed a number of other bike games as well, even as far back as Tourist Trophy from the makers of Gran Turismo, which is still my favourite bike game of all time. So until next time, I'll see you then, and for now, as always, thanks for watching.